Hi, welcome back. Yuri, thanks for joining me today. How you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. Thank you for having me, Al. How are you?
I'm doing well as well. It's been an eventful morning, and I'm excited to talk with you because in talking with Reese, you all are doing some very interesting things there at Deep Blue Signals, and I know you've been steeped in the math, so I'd love to hear what you have to say. If you would introduce yourself and a little bit about what you do, not only at Deeper Signals, but at NYU.
Yeah, sure. All right. I am Uri. I am a IO psychologist by training. Also the co-founder of Deeper Signals. You've just heard a lot about that from Reese. And as well, as you mentioned, Al, I lecture at NYU on talent assessments and algorithms. And our most recent course that we gave in the spring, actually, just as COVID-19 was coming at us, was called Algorithmic Responsibility, which is, which was focused on algorithms and how to use them in a responsible way.
Well, you're certainly talking my language when you talk like that, because obviously that aligns with the people data for good movement that we have. Can you explain what algorithmic responsibility means to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, chatting with you about it, Al, is special, being an expert in this. So, but our take on it in the course was, um, you know, algorithms are everywhere. We like to think about it, or at least I like to talk to my students about it in the sense that you can't escape algorithms. You have to just choose which ones you use and how to use them. That goes as far as we are algorithms in a sense, right? And so humans are constantly taking in lots of data and making have some kind of predefined set of processes to help you solve a problem, often a prediction, right? And so we're either using our own algorithms or we are using machine algorithms or AI algorithms, or maybe if you're in Elon Musk's Neuralink system, you have figured out how to connect them, right? But in some way, you're using an algorithm, and so the idea of using it responsibly, you can think about it like that as well, right? You have to use your own algorithms responsibly, and
Hmm.
I think that's what the world is showing us now, is that many of us have uh, defective algorithms in how we view the world and how we come to decisions, and then algorithms that we use in the workplace, in the people analytics function, also have a set of a culture around them that needs to be designed in a way that helps us use them responsibly.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that. And it's very clear to me for those who aren't steeped in this work, I ask you a couple of things, and there's going to be a third trailing. When we talk about algorithms, we can talk about how the math is structured, and we can also talk about the variables themselves. In other words, the data that makes up those, because there's cliche but true, garbage in, garbage out. And so I've been talking a lot lately about the appropriateness of the data, which in turn speaks to the appropriateness of the math. So, how do you break those two down? How do you think about the data itself, the inputs, and the math, the actual process that is undertaken to analyze the data?
I mean, great way of putting it. And both are really important. Um, I actually think it's changing a bit. And so it used to be that you can look at the data as being the more simple part of the algorithm, right? And you can assess the either quality of the data or the ethics of the data, as in, should you be using that data quite easily. Whereas the math, is the murky part that maybe only mathematicians or statisticians understand, and that's where you can easily obfuscate what's going into it, and you can confuse people and convince them to potentially use an algorithm that is unethical or irresponsible.
Mhm.
However, obviously, as data increases, the amount of data that we have access to increases. That's becoming more and more uh, unclear as well. And so now you have AI algorithms that can be processing hundreds of thousands of dependent variables. Now it becomes quite hard to identify the data itself and make decisions around how responsible or ethical it is to be using that data. And that's, just not to belabor that point, but what you often have is, algorithms using algorithms or data being used in different areas of the organization. And in one area, it may be ethical or responsible to use that information, but then it goes into the system, and then you have a data engineer somewhere else who may not know everything about the data or the conclusions that were reached or the error margins that were acceptable in context A, to create those metrics or numbers, and then use that in a follow-up prediction or a downstream prediction that no longer makes sense, or it's no longer ethical to be making those kind of decisions or absorb that kind of risk.
Yeah, I a virtual hug for you saying that because it's true and it's not often understood. It then invites the question from an organizational perspective or as a people analyst, someone who's actually doing the work within an organization. What do we do about it? How do we mitigate the risk? What do you say to people who ask that question?
I mean, it's a tough one, right? I mean, so a few things. Uh, Again, starting with, you will be using an algorithm no matter what. So just taking what might seem like the easy road out and saying, we won't use algorithms, or we'll just use people, for example, is not necessarily a solution. Um, Take, for example, the case of assessments, right, which we are quite familiar with. You can avoid using any kind of assessment in making important decisions, and instead use a human interviewer. And let's say we're talking about assessments for hiring. We know as HR professionals all of the bias that comes along with interviewers, right? They're maybe the greatest risk in making fair hiring decisions. And so that is not a good way out. What you can do, I think, as a first step, is create a culture in the organization that promotes and reinforces the need and the importance of acting ethically and responsibly with data. And that starts with underscoring the risk and the negative implications that can happen when you have an algorithm that has gone bad. Because I think,
Hmm.
there's too often there's not enough awareness in organizations for how significant the impact can be.
Hmm.
I love
It,
Kathy O'Neill and the term weapons of mass destruction. Right.
Pardon me. It's absolutely. I have it on my shelf over here as well, and because
Yeah.
you're absolutely spot on, right? It is ripe with risk. It's also ripe with opportunity. To draw those distinctions is not only difficult, it takes a level of expertise, level of time, level of inquiry that not many people, let alone organizations, allocate. They just, okay, here's a tool, throw some data in it, and now we're off and running and using it. Where I advocate that we actually have processes that uh, gate whether or not a tool or set of data or algorithm are appropriate. So my pointed question to you is this, is that right now many organizations are kind of underdeveloped with their data governance processes and the means, particularly within HR data and analytics. Do you advocate any form of ongoing governance where you actually have to pass some gates or wickets in order to get to the next stage? I mean, what would be some of the processes that you would see implemented that would mitigate risk of things going awry? And if you have example, great. If not, if that's fine too, because in my belief, in my experience, most organizations don't have such a thing yet, and it has to be created. And I'm really trying to advocate that these types of processes be created. But what's your thought and perspective on that?
They're very similar. So absolutely speaking my language, I think just like you have GDPR or CCPA now as a government source of regulation on on big data and on tech companies using algorithms and our data in an ethical way, organizations need to have a version of that, and every organization needs to have that. And it can be, the way I see it is, it needs to be maybe slightly different than just a gatekeeper, but a COE, right?
Mhm.
With HR, or probably HR and people analytics, and potentially strategy professionals also trained in algorithmic responsibility, right? DNI would be
Mhm.
another good perspective to have there, and they're
Mhm.
taking a view of everything going on in the organization related to data. And if that's their whole focus, they will be the ones to catch not just the flagrant areas where someone wants to do something that's clearly unethical, but also those really hard to detect mistakes, like we talked about. And I remember when I was doing engagement back at S&P, you know, for example, we were trying to predict attrition, right? And you didn't
Mhm.
you didn't look at the history of every data point that we had in our HRIS system to see, is that something which is ethical to use as a predictor of attrition, right? You just tried to throw everything at the wall and see
Mhm.
if anything predicts attrition, right? And then when you stop and
Yeah.
think about that, which of course we did, you're like, wait, is that really something which is an ethical way of predicting whether someone's going to leave?
It's absolutely spot on, and something that I had long questioned. What is the value not only to the organization ultimately, but to the individuals themselves, because they could be identified as a false positive. Went down to the individual level. So, is that fair if there are certain interventions that result from that? Now, what we're talking about obviously goes very quickly into ethics. And so, one of the things that I see, and I echo what you shared around a COE. COEs have been largely around data governance and privacy, so making sure legally and there's these walls set up. But in terms of the ethics, that's been more kind of esoteric. It's been viewed arguably as a nice to have in many organizations. But what I hear you saying is this COE, and what I also heard you say, it's not inside of HR, it'd be beyond HR, and HR might have a subcomponent, correct me if I'm wrong, but it would also address the ethical nature and make some decisions, because by its very nature, ethics is gray, and some
Yeah.
are darker gray than others. But decisions ultimately have to be made, and that then would require maybe someone beyond a technology background, beyond a legal background, somebody who's really steeped in what it means to be an ethical, responsible organization. Would you? Agree with that? Would you want to add anything, any color to that? And going back in particular to how the COE would be structured.
Yeah, yeah. I want to give you a great example of of that, which is out of the HR domain. So we had a guest lecturer in my class who was doing his PhD at MIT in autonomous driving.
Mm.
And so one of the things he raised were the algorithms used to detect a pedestrian, right? And the algorithm is then making a call. Is that is that a lamppost or is it a pedestrian? And if it's trained predominantly on the demographic around the tech company or the test site, uh, will that be biased against minorities potentially if that's a white area, or will it against any other person, um, given the training data, right? And that's
Mhm.
something that obviously they have to be concerned about. But what he brought up was, let's say you find out that in fact there is a bias there, right? The algorithm needs tweaking. But once you finish tweaking the algorithm, you can flip the switch and autonomous driving will now be a thing. Well, people are dying every single day without autonomous driving because of
Hmm.
human-caused car accidents. So how do you make that ethical call? At what point do you have to be sure enough that your algorithm isn't biased in order to flip the switch and start autonomous driving? And that's just one example, but I think it really underscores how more and more of these dilemmas that we have in HR as well are not going to be clear cut, yes and no decisions that's a flagrant violation of privacy, or you're going to be predicting now that, a certain person or a certain group of people or certain actions are going to cause people not to get promoted. That's easy. What will be hard is when neither decision is clear cut. And that's where you need the ethicists.
Because we could, under that example, and I don't think it's out of the realm of reasonableness in terms of possibility, we could get to a future state where there is automated hiring and potentially even automated firing, automated org design, where we have these systems that are doing what we as humans formerly did. And there's a lot of proof out there that humans have been suboptimal, particularly on the hiring side. What are your thoughts there? And again, there's ethical questions all over this, but is that a place where you think we're moving to just more inputs that are data driven, that are going to do now 80-90% of the work, whereas humans, we used to do 80-90% of the work? What's your thought there?
I may have a slightly counter perspective here to what others say, but I think a lot of the automated hiring, specifically the video analysis of like facial features and other features in a video, in order to predict future performance, um, is questionable, and not necessarily because the science isn't there to show that it can predict performance, but I think we have to take other things into account. And so we have to, as an organization, we have to have processes that also make sense to people, that people can
Mm-hmm.
understand and feel is a fair and just way of making important decisions, life-changing decisions, like hiring decisions and firing decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think while there might be a future there, we need to put as much time and effort and energy that we put into those kinds of tools, into also humanizing them, being really transparent about them, and describing what they actually do, and also in improving the other side of the coin, which is what role do humans play in the hiring decisions? And yes, to your point, they are biased, but how much training do we do to try to debias them? Because just like we're willing to
Mm-hmm.
put a lot of work into debiasing AI algorithms, we should be putting a lot of work into helping managers and hiring managers make more fair and ethical decisions.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, that idea that we do have autonomous hiring is not something I certainly advocate. I just see that there's a possibility. Who thought autonomous vehicles would be the norm or the emerging norm? I'm just really curious as we move forward how we're going to put boundaries on these tools and ideas, and if HR leaders, if people analytics professionals don't have a position on this, they're going to be influenced, potentially overly so, by the vendor community. And I do not want to imply that the vendor community, is not good in any stretch of the imagination. However, their job, by its very nature, is to innovate, to push the envelope, to get new things out there. And again, there has to be some boundaries, I would think. So, is that what you would advocate too? Is that leaders, people, analysts, professionals, HR business partners truly educate themselves so they can identify what's where the boundaries are for their organization?
Yeah, I mean, so that's what we're teaching. That was the goal, the thinking behind a class called Algorithmic Responsibility for HR professionals, right? It's to help procurement and HR leaders have that view when they're looking at vendors, right? Have that ethical view to both be innovative and creative and take on some of these new tools, but do it in an ethical way. And I think one just to put out there, one clear-cut strategy that always helps in almost any context when you're measuring or assessing an algorithm or a tool is state out or ask the vendor or the stakeholder to state out exactly what the algorithm is doing, not what the prediction is or not what the outcome is or the value, but transparently what the algorithm predicts, and then what inferences we're making from that. And that's always a critical gap. Because if I were to use, for example, because you brought it up, a facial recognition, facial predictor for hiring, right, of future performance, right? On the one hand, I can state that as, this tool will predict who will perform in your organization, and that's the unclear way of describing it. Or I can say this tool can predict with a certain amount of confidence, right, and an error margin of y, that people who you have interviewed are similar to whoever the test case of data were, right? High potentials, marked as high potentials by managers at a certain level or above in the organization. Mm-hmm. When you describe it that way, everyone can start asking questions and having a conversation about it. Who are the high potentials? Who said they were high potentials? Is there bias there? How about the error margin? And so on.
Yeah, no, I love it. At the end of the day, we have to have real conversations about this. We can't be overrun by the narrative that we're getting from vendors and academics and others. In other words, bright light, bright light. We have to understand what's appropriate for our reality at that point in time. And I'm so celebrate that you have this class, that you're advocating for this, not only in your teaching pursuits, but also there at Deeper Signals. So as we start to wrap up, any closing comments, and how can people learn more about you and Deeper Signals?
Brilliant. Closing comments would be to think about these things if you're an HR professional. In Deeper Signals, we promote this as well. In our coaching sessions and in our team sessions and with our clients, we say often, personality is not prophecy, right? And that's another way of saying, even in our assessments, which we're quite proud of and we think that work quite well, we recognize that there's a margin of error there. It's an algorithm that's predicting an outcome. You are likely to be this kind of person or to have these dispositions, but we understand we can get it wrong sometimes. And so I think that perspective, a bit of humility for all of the HR and especially people analytic folks out there, will be really helpful in promoting this culture of algorithmic responsibility. And to learn more about me, I'm on LinkedIn, Uri Ort. And to learn more about my company, go to deepersignals.com, and we'd love to chat about any of these things.
All right, Uri, again, congratulations on what you and your team are doing over there, and look forward to seeing you before too long. Hopefully, probably next year, but hopefully it'll be not too long. So
sooner rather than later. Yeah. Thank you so much, Al.
We hope. Be well. All right.
Bye.
See ya.